But I'm Dan Stone, the chair of the Programs and Exhibits Committee of the Jewish Heritage Center. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this launch of an important book that Arthur will be talking about later, so I won't say much. I will point out that the Asper Center is on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Oji Cree nations, and the homeland of the Métis. And this formula gets spoken all the time. I hope you'll think about it and look into which parts of it are oversimplifications and which part are things that you should be looking at in much greater depth. But here tonight we have a significant book on Winnipeg history, and the Jewish Heritage Center is particularly happy to be involved in the launch because there was a lot of the archives of the Jewish Heritage Center that was involved in the research for the book. Just a indication. I claim, since I didn't write it, but try to give us part of the glory of it. 16 of the 28 illustration credits are from the archives of the Jewish Heritage Center, and I didn't try to count the footnotes, but I'm sure it was a substantial percentage also. The Jewish Heritage Center, for those of you who are not familiar with it, has a mission of exploring and publicizing in all sorts of ways Jewish history of Manitoba and more broadly Western Canada. And a second part of the mission is Holocaust education. If you haven't been to the campus, or if you haven't been recently, take a look at our display on the first floor. It's go to the end, go to the theater, turn left. We have part of an exhibit on part of our exhibit. Part of it, unfortunately, is closed for repairs, and a little bit beyond it is the Holocaust Education Center, which is an exhibit, as you imagine, a small museum of the Holocaust based on survivors who came to Winnipeg and contributed their own artifacts to making up this museum. So it's, in a sense, a very local museum. The Heritage Center is involved in all these things, and it has a particular upcoming event I'd like to point out. One of our major events of the year, and also our major fundraising event, is the Saul and Florence Caney Distinguished Lecture Series on May 13th, a Monday night. Brett Stevens, an op-ed contributor to the New York Times, formerly editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, a Wall Street Journal journalist who won a Pulitzer Prize for his work there, will be talking on the rise of populism, nationalism, and hate, a very current subject. So this is Monday, May 13th at Shaare Zedek Synagogue. Talk to me or someone from the Jewish Heritage Center here tonight if you'd like more information. This contributes a lot to keeping our organization going. I'll also mention ongoing support from the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg, which contributes annually and helps us run our activities. Now, as I said, we're particularly pleased to run this, to be organizing this event on our own territory. But we're not in this by ourselves. We share common interests with the Manitoba Historical Society, and I'd like to ask Professor John Lair, to come and say hello for the Manitoba Historical Society.
Thank you, Don. Hello. On behalf of the Manitoba Historical Society, I want to say it gives us great pleasure to be involved in this event. We cooperate a lot with the Jewish Heritage Center, and it's a real privilege for us to be involved today in the launching of Professor Ross's book. And I congratulate him on his launch. Thank you very much.
The University of Manitoba Press, of course, the publisher, is the third partner in tonight's enterprise, and they prefer to speak through their book and their author. So we'll leave it at that for the moment, except to acknowledge the terrific work that the University of Manitoba Press does year in, year out on all kinds of subjects, but especially of a special interest to us is its publication of material about Manitoba and its history in all kinds of aspects. Without it, knowledge of what has happened in this province would be immeasurably weaker. So I will, in a moment, I'll introduce Arthur, the author, and then after he finishes, there'll be a question and answer period. There's a microphone over on that side from which you can ask questions or make comments, and after that there are some light refreshments in the back. Now, the author of this very impressive book is Arthur Ross, Winnipeg born and raised, from a family very well noted for its public service. He has a BA Honors from the University of Winnipeg, Master of Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a doctorate from the University of Toronto. Arthur has been professor at the Ryerson University in Toronto in the Department of Politics and Public Administration. He's a member of the graduate faculty. As this book suggests, his teaching and research interests are in immigration policy and the history of the role of communal solidarity in establishing immigrant self-help organizations. Arthur?
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm so delighted to see you all. It's really quite a compliment to me, and also I think a compliment to the subject that we all hold dear, for you to have come on this occasion. I also want to thank the University of Manitoba Press, of course, and I also want to thank the Manitoba Historical Society, the co-sponsors of this event. I hope that this book, in one way or another, contributes to our understanding of how, in the pre-welfare state era that we all take for granted, communal solidarity or collective action based on the principles of self-help and mutual aid enabled Jewish immigrants to integrate into Canadian society. They faced many challenges, they faced many obstacles to overcome, and what's fascinating about communal solidarity is that through mutual aid, through helping each other, assuming collective responsibility for all of their well-being and opportunity, they managed to not only integrate into Canadian society, but, my goodness, succeed beyond any of their expectations. But the real reason I wrote this book, and I must be very honest, is that I wanted to acknowledge the sacrifices and celebrate the achievement of a remarkable generation of Jews, including my grandparents, the Jewish immigrants who really laid the foundation of this Jewish community. When I was a child, I often visited the Mount Carmel Clinic, where my mother was the executive director. And while I waited for her, I often sat and gazed at this collection of cameo photos. Fascinated, of course, by their antiquated dress, but more importantly, I slowly began to appreciate the look of resolve and determination in their eyes. And what fascinated me was not only the fact that these individuals, as my mother explained, had built the Mount Carmel Clinic, literally built it, but that this group of individuals, both men and women, were immigrants who had come to this country and yet in a very short period of time had achieved so much. Between 1882, when 360 Jewish refugees arrived in Winnipeg, and 1931, when the government of Canada essentially barred all immigrants, or at least made it extremely difficult for immigrants to come to this country, approximately 11,500 Jewish immigrants settled in this city. The vast majority of them, including my grandparents, and I suspect many of your grandparents, or perhaps your parents, the founders of the Jewish community came between 1902 and 1914. The population of the Jewish community at the turn of that century was approximately 1,000. By the end of the first decade, it mushroomed to over 10,000 and then peaked at about 15,000 in 1916. 80% of those who came in that formative period came from what is called the Pale of Settlement, more commonly known as southwestern provinces of Ukraine. This map might be difficult to make out, but if you focus on the lower left, Volhynia, Kiev, Podolia, and so on, Kherson, those were the areas which essentially account for the immigrants who came to Winnipeg. And the reason that I can say that with some confidence is not only the fact that so many of the names of Landsmannschaften or mutual aid societies bear the names of communities in those provinces, but one of the facts of immigration life was chain migration. In other words, there would be an immigrant who left one of the shtetls in that region of the Pale, made his or her way to Winnipeg, usually because there was a relative here. That individual, like my grandfather, would perhaps sponsor his family. And that process of relative sponsoring relative meant that there was, in fact, a very small pool of Jews who constituted the foundation of Winnipeg's Jewish community. They came from places like Meserich, which had a Jewish population in 1900 of 456, Yedinitz, which had a Jewish population in 1900 of about 7,300, or my father's birthplace, Gordnitsa, with a population of 1,300. And I was somewhat astounded when I visited Gordnitsa just 2 years ago with my son to walk down one of the main streets and to be told that this street is Sholem Aleichem Street, not what I expected in a small Ukrainian community in Volhynia. A majority of the immigrants who came to Winnipeg during this period settled in the North End. And I realize it's difficult to make out the figures, but you can see almost 6,000 live between McGregor and Main Street, between the CPR tracks and between boroughs. That was the heart of the North End. And of course, bisecting that district was Selkirk Avenue. And I always used to imagine what the Earl of Selkirk, looking down on Selkirk Avenue of the 1920s, must have thought. The Hebrew Sick Benefit Hall, Grozny's Confectionery, Rosen's Grocery Store, and of course, Aretsky's, and many other Jewish establishments. I think he would have been rather surprised. As I learned in grade 4 from Ms. Campbell, the founder, of course, of Manitoba was the Earl of Selkirk, who generously enabled displaced Scottish crofters to cross the ocean and to settle in Manitoba, neatly ignoring Indigenous history. Ms. Campbell impressed upon us the fact that this epic event was the founding of Manitoba. And in later years, I reflected on that very educational history lesson and thought to myself, well, looking around the room at my Jewish Canadian, Polish Canadian, German Canadian, and Ukrainian Canadian classmates, I thought, well, Selkirk's saga explains your presence, Ms. Campbell, but doesn't really explain very much about all the rest of us. In other words, it didn't really tell very much about immigration history. And that is what I hope I've been able to do in this book. For all of you who are native Winnipeggers, perhaps some proud North Enders, perhaps some proud former North Enders who've defected and moved south, one of the defining characteristics of Winnipeg, of course, is not only the overwhelming concentration, at least in 1916, of Jews in the North End, a smattering of Jews in Elmwood, and a smaller population in central Winnipeg, mostly close to the CPR tracks, but also at least those who were somewhat more successful and had accumulated, at least in comparative terms, some wealth in the area near Broadway. And of course, the South End. The South End, which at that time had 618 Jewish residents. Keep this geographic distinction in mind because, as I'll explain in a few moments, it had a great deal to explain about the nature of some of the conflicts that emerged in Winnipeg during this period. What's impressive about the founders, the 8,000 who came between 1902 and 1914 of the Jewish community, is that based on egalitarian principles of communal solidarity, they established a comprehensive system of social welfare. They established 56 mutual aid societies, often called Landsmannschaften, often called free loan societies, often called mutual benefit societies. They established a communal charity that assisted the destitute. They established an orphanage, an old age home, and finally, of course, in 1926, the Mount Carmel Clinic. But their commitment to communal solidarity was not limited to Winnipeg. Shortly after the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Russian army adopted a very explicit policy of essentially expelling Jews from provinces near the front line. In other words, from anywhere where they might be in contact with the invading German army. And they forced them, and I'm talking about an estimated 500,000 people, they forced them to relocate hundreds of miles to the east. In other words, over 500,000 Jews became destitute, displaced, and most importantly, homeless. In Winnipeg, of course, news of these events sent a shockwave through the Jewish community. And activists, communal activists, organized a fundraising drive that led to the formation of the Western Jewish Fund for the Relief of War Sufferers. And astonishingly, between 1915 and 1922, when the energy of the Jewish community began to focus on bringing refugees to Canada rather than trying to aid them in Eastern Europe, that organization raised $390,000 in cash, $390,000. And they also contributed $100,000 in medical supplies and clothing. They also assisted a national Jewish organization to bring 146 Jewish orphans from Ukraine to Canada, and 12 of the orphans were placed in the care of the Jewish orphanage. And just to give you a sense of how devastated the Jewish community in Ukraine in particular was, the physicians who were sent from Canada to select orphans to come to Canada had to interview and examine over 500 Jewish children in order to bring 146 to Canada. They were so medically unfit that they would not pass the inspection of immigration officials upon their arrival in Canada. And in 1920, when the government of Canada abandoned its pre-war immigration policy, which was quite open and enabled most Jews to come to this country with few obstacles or few restrictions, abandoned that pre-war immigration policy and began to impose restrictions which were specifically targeted at Jews. In the words of Frederick Blair, a senior official who later became famous because he coined the phrase, "None is too many." According to Frederick Blair, their coming was a catastrophe that had to be avoided. And he did everything within his power as a senior official who had the ear of powerful ministers of immigration to block the admission of Jewish refugees. But in Winnipeg and in Toronto and in Montreal, communal activists established the Western Division of the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. And what they succeeded in doing in the 1920s is overcoming the resistance of officials, overcoming the resistance of politicians, and negotiated 3 quotas, in other words, 3 agreements with the federal government, which enabled 8,500 Jewish refugees to come to this country during the 1920s. And hundreds of them, of course, settled in Winnipeg. Now, as I piece together the histories of the mutual aid societies, of the social welfare institutions that provided Jewish immigrants who settled in Winnipeg with a substantial measure of social security, the organizations that participated in international efforts to first alleviate the suffering of Jews in Eastern Europe, primarily in Ukraine, and later, despite very restrictive immigration laws, to help thousands of Jews to rebuild their lives in Canada, I was left with a number of questions. First, how could a relatively small Jewish community, approximately 8,000 adults, raise over $150,000 to establish an orphanage? That's $3.4 million approximately in 2019 terms. How could they raise $58,000 or about $1.3 million each year to finance the organizations that they established? That is the orphanage, the old age home, and the Mount Carmel Clinic. And how, in addition, could they contribute about $23,000, or in contemporary terms, $500,000, 25 cents at a time, in monthly membership dues to mutual aid societies, to Landsmannschaften? How could they raise, as I mentioned previously, $390,000 in 2019 terms, $8.6 million for international aid, and thousands upon thousands of dollars in addition to support the Western Division of the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society? This was an astonishing accomplishment by any measure, especially when considering that Jewish immigrants in this period had very modest incomes. I laboriously went through census data, cursing enumerators not doing their jobs properly, but I eventually was able to put together a profile of Jews, both workers and self-employed. And what I discovered was that although the general consensus at that time was that a Jewish family of 4 or 5 individuals needed about $968 in income a year for the bare necessities, very few Jews earned that amount. Very few Jews, in fact, earned close to that amount. 2/3 of all male Jewish workers were skilled, tailors, tinsmiths, semi-skilled workers such as clerks or drivers, or unskilled. And the average income that they earned was $778, considerably less. About 1/3 of male Jewish immigrants were self-employed, typically small business owners, and they earned on average of about $1,000 a year. Only 11% of all income earners had an income of more than $968. And the obvious question that I suppose you're thinking, the obvious question that needs to be asked and answered is, how was it possible for them to survive? How was it possible for them to subsist while earning less than the amount they needed for bare necessities? Well, of course, mutual aid societies played a very important role. Individuals who could not save, by joining mutual aid societies, at least had the security of replacement income if they became ill, if they became unemployed. And a death benefit was extremely important, perhaps $500 from the mutual aid society to enable someone who had died to have a decent Jewish burial. And of course, some mutual aid societies also provided free loans, and that was crucial for small Jewish businessmen and, of course, for the average Jew who couldn't save enough money to perhaps afford steamship tickets to bring their relatives to Canada. So how did they survive? Well, and I hope I don't offend anyone by mentioning some family names in a moment or two, there were essentially 2 strategies. Children, both male and female, started work at age 15, a very young age. The 1916 census reveals that only 15 young Jews over the age of 14 attended school. Working was simply expected, and more to the point, it was absolutely necessary. For example, the Burgle family relied on $600, $350 or so less than the minimum required to survive. The Burgle family relied on the father's earnings, but that was supplemented by the incomes of 2 sons who worked as drivers, contributing an extra $1,250 between them. Of course, the problem for Burgle Sr. was what would happen when their sons decided to leave home and establish their own families. Fewer daughters worked. 94% of young males and older males worked, but only 21% of females. Very few women, only a handful worked outside the home after the age of 22. And that, of course, is a clear signal that by the age of 22, a young woman fulfilled her destiny by getting married. Those young women who worked earned half of what young men earned. For example, a female factory worker would earn $300. Her brother, perhaps a year older, would earn $600. So without the income of children, families could not survive. Another strategy was to take in boarders. The Merson family, a father, mother, and 6 children, depended on the $780 a year that the father earned as a driver. Again, inadequate. But they had 3 boarders. And those boarders, and boarders were very common, contributed additional income to the family. But some families relied exclusively on the income of the father. The Altman family, for example, the father, a harness maker. I hope he was retraining, 1916. I think harness making was not going to be a viable occupation very, very long. Supported himself, his wife, a child, and his mother-in-law on an annual income of $780. Now clearly, with so little disposable income, raising money to establish and to maintain, raising the vast sums that I've described to you, to make it possible through communal solidarity for Jews to assist each other, was an enormous challenge. It was only possible because of an extraordinary level of communal activism. What's striking about the establishment of the social welfare institutions that I've studied and written about in my book is that there were very few large donors. In fact, most of the large donations came from mutual aid societies that, in addition to supporting their members, used their surpluses to, for example, donate money to the Mount Carmel Clinic. Hundreds and thousands of women and men served as volunteers, whether fundraisers, Jews paying members of organizations like the Jewish Orphanage, or indeed the Mount Carmel Clinic, or they served on boards of directors. So what explains, at a time when Jews were basically struggling to survive and very few, only 11%, enjoyed an income above the minimum required to survive, is this tremendous amount of communal activism, that small contributions collected by the thousands made up for whatever large donations were simply not forthcoming. But the other question I asked myself is, how was it that Jewish immigrants essentially reinvented themselves as communal activists? They came to Canada on average at the age of 31. In other words, the fact that they came between 1902 and 1914 is very, very significant. They grew up in communities which were governed by what I described as traditional forms of authority. Communities where rabbis and men of wealth, or at least men of comparative wealth, in the context of the small shtetl that the Jews lived in, controlled decision-making. Controlled decision-making, for example, in communal welfare organizations, the Hevrot, the communal organizations that dispense charity. These small communities had very rigid hierarchies. Inherited status, inherited wealth and power was passed from one generation to the next. And certainly in the broader Russian society, Jews were subject to laws, edicts, regulations, which made it impossible for them to organize any type of association. Civil associations were deeply distrusted by the Tsarist state. It made it impossible for them in many cases to share ideas because of censorship, and it certainly made it impossible for them to travel in many instances because they were restricted to their places of birth and needed special passes to travel elsewhere. So what aspects of their pre-immigration experience enabled Jewish immigrants to quickly, upon arrival in Canada, within a very short period of time, like the members of the board of directors of the Mount Carmel Clinic, become practitioners of democracy, to not only master the principles and procedures of democratic decision-making, but to become extraordinarily adept at mobilizing support to establish organizations and then fund them and manage them. No small matter. Third, what factors explain the prominent role of women? Yes, the social construction of gender roles, meaning most women worked within the home, not outside of the home, and those who became involved in communal activities were often members of women's auxiliaries. But women founded the Jewish orphanage. They also played a significant role in establishing the Mount Carmel Clinic. They also served on the board of directors of the Mount Carmel Clinic, the Jewish orphanage, as well as the old folks home, and they also served prominently on the board of the Western Jewish Fund for the Relief of War Sufferers. In other words, women were co-activists. They also entered the public realm and became contributors to their society. But the scope of women's activism is somewhat surprising because most Jewish communities were bound by tradition. In other words, religious observance and parental authority defined most young women's lives. Denied education, and I often remember my mother telling me, she came to this country at the age of 10 from Samgororek. I often remember my mother telling me of her frustration and anger as she followed her brother, Nathan, her beloved older brother, to the cheder and could only look through the window and see him getting an education. And she said to me, all I could think of as I saw my brother and all the other boys getting an education, why not me? Why couldn't I have an education? Their education was largely domestic. Their education consisted of preparation for marriage and their ultimate responsibilities as wives and mothers. Given this very narrow definition of the role of women in the shtetl of the Pale Settlement, what enabled them to supersede these very rigid gender roles that had defined them and enter the public sphere? What is it that accounts for this incredible transformation? And the final question, how did institutions like the Canadian Jewish Orphanage become the Jewish Orphanage and Children's Aid Society of Western Canada? How did the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, founded in Winnipeg, become the Western division of the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, serving all of Western Canada? In other words, what was the relationship between Winnipeg, which was, of course, then the metropolis of the West? What was the relationship between the Jewish community of Winnipeg, the largest in Western Canada, and the countless Jewish communities scattered across rural Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even, of course, Vancouver? Now, the answer, I think, to all of these questions is to examine the pre-immigration lives of Jewish immigrants who settled in Winnipeg, particularly the 8,000 who arrived after 1902. After the wave of pogroms, which devastated over 260 Jewish communities in 1882, the pogroms which were instigated following the assassination of the Tsar, Jews faced a crisis. How could they, given their oppression and given the violence that they were subjected to, hope to have a future in Tsarist Russia? But the crisis was made worse because there was a crisis also of confidence in traditional leaders, in both the rabbinate and also in secular leaders. Faced with increasing violence as well as laws and regulations that made their poverty so much worse year after year and denied them opportunities to move to Kiev where they might get an education, traditional Jewish leaders counseled acceptance and restraint. They basically argued that we must appease the authorities, not challenge the authorities. But sweeping through the shtetls of the Pale Settlement at this time were very influential ideas spread by Maskilim, supporters of the Haskalah, which was the Jewish Enlightenment, that promoted the idea of self-determination. The Jews should take charge of their own destiny, that they should embrace a secular identity and begin to hopefully integrate into Russian society. Well, young activists weren't sure about integrating into Russian society, given the prejudice and the violence they faced, but they were certainly captivated by the possibility that Jews could chart their own destiny, that they could determine their own futures. And they began to join new organizations, most famously, of course, the General Jewish Workers' Party, commonly known as the Bund, composed of individuals who argued that only socialism could free Jews from their oppression and enable them to determine their own future. They also joined Pale Zion, the Workers of Zion, which proclaimed that self-determination could only be achieved by creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine based on, again, socialist principles. Alternatively, autonomous argued, Simon Dubno being one of the most important advocates of this perspective, suggested that Jews could achieve communal autonomy within the Tsarist Empire, that they could set up their own self-governing institutions and on the basis of local community councils establish a national Jewish organization. And then fewer in number, there were Zionists who argued, of course, that the future of Jews could only be secured in Palestine. As they competed for the support, offering one solution or another to the challenge facing the Jewish community, facing Jews who believed they did not have a future, as they competed for support, they trained thousands of supporters, thousands of young people to be political activists, educating them about constitutions, educating them about democratic practices, educating them, in effect, about how to determine their own future. And this upsurge in political mobilization, this upsurge in political activity, was only possible because of the emergence of Yiddish as a language, not only of cultural renewal, but a language of mass communication, displacing Hebrew as the most important form of communication. The explosive growth in the late 19th and early 20th century of Yiddish language publications, books, journals, newspapers, led to the establishment of reading circles and libraries, public places free from the surveillance or the scrutiny of leaders of the small shtetl where they grew up, where young people could meet, where they could discuss, and scandalously for parents and scandalously for rabbis, where young men and women could meet outside of the gaze or the surveillance of parents or their elders. These libraries, these reading circles, allowed young people to exchange ideas, especially for young women, new ideas that challenge traditional gender roles. And I want to read a brief excerpt from a memoir that was written by someone who may be known to members of the audience, if only because of his famous son. And I'm referring to Felix Zolf, who was a longtime teacher at the Parrott School. And he describes growing up in the shtetl of Zastevye, what it was like, especially for the elders of the community, when a library was established. He states that the pious Jews who gathered in the Midrash, in the Bet Midrash, the house for Torah study, reacted to the establishment of a library with alarm, denouncing those who spread heretical views in their midst, and parents tried to convince their children not to use the library. But the word library was like a magical incantation, a siren that enticed people there, and no force in the world could keep them back. The library became a popular meeting place for Zastevye's Jewish youths, who threw themselves into the books with life and soul, devouring them just like hotcakes. Every book went from hand to hand. And it's hard to imagine in contemporary terms that libraries and reading circles would be such a radical innovation. But in the cloistered world of the shtetls, through the medium of new Yiddish language publications, particularly books, it opened up a whole new world of ideas. So these young people read, for instance, popular writers like Ayel Peretz, who wrote about the religious and social conventions that thwarted the ambitions of women and perpetuated their subservience. Also Shlomo Aleichem, whose short stories about Tevye the milkman and his daughters, published between 1894 and 1914, more famous perhaps because of the musical Fiddler on the Roof than the actual books that he published, portrayed conflicts between an older generation immersed in tradition and young women struggling to make their own choices, particularly their own choices about who they would marry. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting, and many of you know your family's personal histories, I am not in any way suggesting that all the Jewish immigrants who settled in Winnipeg during this formative period were members of the Bund or were members of Pale Zion. Although socialists, both men and women, played a prominent role in the organization of the Western Jewish Fund for the Relief of War Sufferers and the Western Division of the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society. And I'm certainly not suggesting that all the young women who came to this country or grew up here in this formative period essentially rejected the authority of their parents and embraced radical ideas about their role in society. But they did certainly have the experience of meeting in public places to read and discuss ideas about social issues and Jewish emancipation. And they seized opportunities, and this was so important for young women, thinking about my mother. They seized opportunities to acquire an education that the Jewish community's religious-based system of education denied them. So although the 1905 revolution, which promised so much, was a bitter disappointment and resulted not in reform, but in more repression, the activism that led up to that revolution, the Bund, Pale Zionists, the Autonomists, created a tremendous change in the mindset of the Jewish immigrants who came to this country, all of whom, as I said, were young, average age 31. Now, whether they came as political activists or whether they were completely apolitical and disinterested in politics, whether they were devoutly religious, as so many were, or whether they simply were adherents of religious tradition and practice, whether they were former members of reading circles that debated ideas about Jewish emancipation and the rights of women, or just casual readers of Jewish language publications and books. The thousands of Jewish immigrants who came during this period experienced the failure of traditional Jewish leaders, men of learning or wealth, to alleviate their poverty or protect them from violence, to protect them from oppression. So I'm trying your patience, I know, and I'm going to stop soon. But I just want to pull all of this together, I hope, and you'll be the judge, pull all of this together by giving you a brief example of how all of these influences, the activism of some in their pre-immigration lives, the transformation of many women's lives through exposure to new radical ideas about the role of women and so on, influence communal solidarity. And I'm going to just use one example, there are many in the book, about the predisposition, the very strong predisposition of Jewish immigrants who arrived between 1902 and 1914 to reject the authority of those who proclaimed that they had the right to decide for the community simply because of their social status or wealth. They asserted instead that communal governance, the governance of the community, decisions, for example, about social welfare, which is the theme of this book, must be based on the authority of all the members of the community. This is the example. In 1912, members of Winnipeg's Jewish community became aware that the Children's Aid Society of Winnipeg was apprehending Jewish children who were judged to be at risk, placed in the custody of the court, and then assigned to Christian orphanages for care. And this, of course, was unacceptable to the Jewish community because the staff of these Christian orphanages would have no understanding of Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, Jewish religion, and most importantly, those children spoke Yiddish for the most part, and how would they be able to communicate with those who were providing them with care? Within 2 months, in 1912, 2 initiatives emerged to open a Jewish orphanage. One initiative, was put forward by a man by the name of R.S. Robinson. And as I was driving around today, I was looking for his house. He lived on Hargrave, near the river, in what in contemporary terms would be described as a very large house, and certainly in terms of this period would be considered to be a mansion. R.S. Robinson was a wealthy man. He lived in central Winnipeg, far distant from the North End. He promised $5,000 if an orphanage was named after his deceased mother. Although questions were raised about the propriety of naming a communal institution after a person, his initiative was supported by a small group of businessmen who lived in central and south end Winnipeg. Now, simultaneously, almost at the exact same time, 18 Jewish women who lived in the North End held a meeting to discuss establishing an orphanage. They launched the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association, and within 3 weeks they had recruited 200 members, most from the North End, all women, and raised $400. A modest sum, but it was a start. Now, obviously, it became apparent to most members of the Jewish community that two initiatives were impossible. The community could not support two different orphanages. There should be cooperation. However, a meeting between the supporters of the proposed Esther Robinson Jewish Orphanage and the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association held in July 1913 failed to reach an agreement. They did agree, however, to have a public meeting, and at the meeting, Robinson and his supporters would present their proposal, and the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association would present their proposal. The idea being that the community would decide. At that meeting, Robinson was criticized for putting his personal agenda ahead of that of the community, for wanting to name an institution irrespective of the wishes of the community after his mother. And according to contemporary press reports, a resolution, a unanimously supported resolution, supported the proposal of the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association. And buoyed by this public mandate, 3 weeks later, on September 22nd, the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association opened the Canadian Jewish Orphans Home in a rented house on Selkirk Avenue. However, undeterred by this public meeting, undeterred by the opposition that he had faced, undeterred by the unanimous endorsation that the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association had received, Robinson and his supporters went ahead and opened the Esther Robinson Jewish Orphanage a few blocks away on Robinson Avenue, literally a few blocks away. Now, with a membership of approximately 900 Jews-paying women, and I want to emphasize that, 900 Jews-paying women, the Hebrew Ladies Orphan Home Association was able to raise enough money to expand their orphanage, and they operated it debt-free. However, the Esther Robinson Jewish Orphanage began to run deficits, and despite their pledges, neither Robinson, who incidentally did not donate $5,000 but scaled it back to $3,000, nor his supporters were prepared to subsidize its operation. And it became quickly apparent that the orphanage, the Esther Robinson Orphanage, could not survive. It had too much debt. So once again, representatives of the Canadian Jewish Orphan Home Association approached the board members of the Esther Robinson Orphanage and said, we must merge our organizations. And that resulted in the establishment of the Jewish Orphanage and Children's Aid Society of Western Canada. Following another public meeting to endorse the new orphanage, in other words, no decision could be made, no future plans could be made without the approval of the community, at least expressed by all those who were prepared to attend a meeting. A 39-member board of directors composed of 19 women and 20 men was elected, and this new board hired an experienced executive director by the name of Louis Greenberg as superintendent, and his first responsibility was to tour Western Canada and to tell all the members of the Jewish communities from Fort William, now Thunder Bay, to Vancouver, that this was their orphanage. And as a result, he went on a speaking tour and met as many of the 13,000 members of those communities that he could to raise money. And as a result, just like the Western Jewish Fund for the Relief of War Sufferers, which had extended the bonds of communal solidarity from Winnipeg throughout Western Canada to raise money for Jews who were starving in Eastern Europe, this publicity tour led to the formation of chapters of the Jewish orphanage throughout Western Canada. And those 13,000 Jews who lived outside of Winnipeg made a substantial contribution to the $122,000 fundraising campaign that built the orphanage that many of you may remember on Matheson Avenue. An interesting example of this, and I'm sorry that you can't see it, this is Mrs. Gurman, and she's proudly holding a silver trowel. When the building fund for the new orphanage was launched, there was a mass meeting held on the site on Matheson Avenue that many of you may know. And the purpose of that mass meeting was to raise money for the orphanage. And in addition to soliciting donations from those who'd come to that meeting of 50 cents for each brick, the idea being that if you donated 50 cents, you actually contributed in a very substantial way to the building of the orphanage, many of those in attendance competed for the honor of donating the cornerstone. Bidding started at $1,000. Mrs. Gurman from Melfort, Saskatchewan, won the right to claim the cornerstone because she gave the largest bid of $2,100. Now imagine, that's 2 years of a worker's income. I love the expression on her face. I would have loved to have met Mrs. Gurman. And you can interpret that expression any way that you like, but I think what she is basically saying, you men did not have what it takes. I was the one who donated the largest sum. I'm the one who has the honor of laying the cornerstone. Now, unquestionably, communal solidarity, that acting collectively, members of Winnipeg's Jewish community could protect each other from many of life's misfortunes, played a crucial role in the integration of Jewish immigrants and enabled them to rebuild their lives in a pre-welfare state era when if an immigrant applied for what we now call social assistance, that immigrant would be deported. In other words, the rules were very clear. Take care of yourself or be deported. Not only did communal solidarity essentially spare many Jewish immigrants who fell into poverty from that fate, but more importantly, it allowed them to build new lives based on financial security. Financial security through mutual aid societies that provided benefits or free loans, the security of knowing that the elderly would be cared for in an old age home, the security of knowing that children would be cared for in an orphanage, and the security of knowing that even if they had no money, they could get free medical care at the Mount Carmel Clinic. But as the example of the orphanage suggests, reconciling differences was often difficult. But whatever their disagreements, and if you compliment me by purchasing the book and reading it carefully, you'll discover that whatever their disagreements, except for a small minority that assumed that their wealth and their status entitled them to hold leadership positions, members of Winnipeg's Jewish community were firmly committed to democratic principles of communal governance. Communal solidarity not only created the Jewish community's system of social welfare, it also laid the foundation most dramatically for international efforts to first aid Jews in Eastern Europe, primarily in Ukraine, but also to rescue them. And if there are many unsung heroes in the Jewish community, I would point to people like Ben Sheps and men like him who made it possible, without exaggeration, for thousands of refugees to come to this country who otherwise, to put it bluntly, would have perished in the Holocaust had they stayed in Eastern Europe. Certainly their accomplishments deserve celebration. I hope I have, in some small way, contributed to an understanding of what they deserve as the beneficiaries of their accomplishments. It's certainly very clear to many of you, I suspect, that the lives that you've enjoyed in Canada are in no small measure due to the decisions and the sacrifices and the accomplishments of your parents and possibly your grandparents. There's no doubt in my mind that I am a beneficiary of communal solidarity. Thank you very much. Now, I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you have. Please don't make them too difficult. But I also want to make a pitch to all of you to support the Jewish Archives. This book, as Dan Stone mentioned earlier, literally could not have been written without the resources of the Archives. The Archives is an amazing institution, does a valiant job of trying to preserve this Jewish community's past. And I think there are more books that could come out of the Archives. I gave a lecture based on this book at Darchei Noam Synagogue in Toronto on the 31st of March. And there were about 100 people there, and I think 85 of the people were from Winnipeg. I don't think they're refugees, I think they're migrants. But I was struck by the fact that if the census could count the number of Jewish emigres from Winnipeg who live in Toronto, that is, members of the Winnipeg Jewish diaspora who live in Toronto, it might be found that there are more Winnipeg Jews there than here, but that's an awkward subject to raise. Please support the Archives. They are a valuable resource. And as someone at the end of that lecture said to me, you may have written an interesting book, but there's another interesting book that needs to be written, and that's about the Peretz School, the Talmud Torah School, Sholem Aleichem School. There needs to be more written about Winnipeg, and it can only be done with the Archives. Please support it. Thank you.
Questions or comments? There's a microphone over there. Please use it, because it's people in the audience won't be able to hear the question otherwise.
How long did these societies last, and do they still exist?
I'm sorry?
How long did they last? Let's say the free loan societies. How long did they flourish?
Well, actually, we were just discussing that a few minutes ago before the lecture began. Most of the free loan societies ceased to exist by the 1940s, although some managed to continue into the 1950s and the 1960s. So essentially, they were the victims of two things. One, the Jewish community was extremely successful in the sense that increasing prosperity made them redundant. And unfortunately, for so many Jews of the generation who came to Canada at this time, the society, as it was known, was not simply a form of mutual benefit and mutual support, it was a social network. And as they aged, it was extremely difficult for them to recruit their children. So the combination of increasing prosperity plus generational change unfortunately led to the decline of mutual aid societies. But they do live on, and I was very pleased when I went through the list of funds which are managed by the Jewish Foundation to notice that, for example, the Kiever Free Loan Society left a legacy, and that legacy was whatever surplus they still had on the books when the organization was dissolved was turned over to the Jewish community. As for The others, well, the Mount Carmel Clinic went through a profound change in the 1950s and 60s. As the Jewish community moved south, it reinvented itself as a community clinic serving the local community and then the broader community. It still exists. The orphanage, of course, was dissolved in 1949, I believe it was. The building was pulled down in 1951. I still sort of see it when I go to Matheson Avenue. The old folks' home,
Speak to the mic.
sorry, the old folks' home moved to Magnus in 1940, I believe. And then when that facility proved to be inadequate, as you all know, it moved south. So communal solidarity persists, and it persists based on the foundation of the contributions and the sacrifices of a very significant generation.
I have a question.
Yes.
In terms of synagogues during that time frame, what impact did they have, or the synagogues have in terms of the communal solidarity? You commented that there was sort of, these are my words, like a rebellion against the religious leaders, but so I'm just curious about that aspect.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and the best way to answer it is to simply acknowledge that the first institutions that Jewish immigrants established when they came to Canada in the 1880s, 1890s, first institutions were synagogues. Unfortunately, as they built synagogues, they engaged in what is familiar to many members of the Jewish community, a certain degree of rivalry as to which synagogue one should belong to. And as a result, the friction between various synagogues resulted in an inability of most of them to maintain their congregations. We're talking in 1901 of a community of just over 1,000 adults and children trying to support 3 synagogues. And as a result, the synagogues were unable, for the most part, to fulfill the traditional obligation of tzedekah, in other words, to provide social welfare. And as a result, when a crisis hit the community, and that is the arrival of a number of not simply poor, but actually destitute Romanian refugees in 1901, the care that they were given was provided as a result of a public meeting. So to answer your question simply, synagogues became the foundation of community life in the beginning, but they proved incapable of providing social welfare. There was also a recognition that whatever synagogue one belongs to, whatever differences one might have between those who believed in a more modern or reform version of Judaism as opposed to an Orthodox version, meeting in public would allow everyone to come together. So the common ground that communal solidarity thrived on was essentially inspired by the long-standing, since time immemorial, practice of Jews supporting each other through charitable works, but it took a different form. In other words, we leave our synagogue affiliations at the door, so to speak, when we go to a meeting of the Workers' Sick Benefit Association.
This is just curiosity, Arthur. The address of the orphanage on Selkirk Avenue, do you have it? I live in the area.
I have it in the book,
Okay.
but I can't recall it.
That's okay.
But it was literally Robinson Avenue. Robinson Avenue was near Schultz. It's now, I don't think it exists anymore, but it's right behind the Mount Carmel Clinic. If you can visualize that, that was Robinson Avenue. I think there's a housing development there, and it's still there. And I'd have to check the address in the book, but I believe the orphanage was either just east or just west of Maine. So literally a stone's throw apart. Yes.
Was the concept of a mutual aid society unique to the Jewish community, or were there other groups at the time that also established these societies for the other immigrants?
Repeat the question, please.
Was the concept of a mutual aid society unique to the Jewish community? No, it wasn't. Mutual aid societies, for example, in Britain, had a history which dated back to the early 1800s, but they were part of Jewish communities in the 1880s, 1890s, in the Pale of Settlement.
No, I mean in Winnipeg.
No, they did not exist. What did exist within the British Canadian community were what I think can most accurately be called fraternal organizations. So the Independent Order of Foresters, for example, which was a fraternal organization that provided a form of insurance, largely life insurance. But the extent to which mutual aid societies, which originated in the Pale of Settlement, not only provided replacement income, but most importantly provided free loans, was very unique and very distinctive.
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thank you very much, the University of Manitoba Press, for bringing this to us, and the Manitoba Historical Society for joining us and sponsoring it, and the audience for taking part in this presentation. I think we've heard enough that we'll start to digest it and not ask too many questions at this point. There are books there to be purchased and to be signed, and there is some coffee in back, so please help yourselves.